I'm going to tell this the way I usually tell it late at night, when the room is quiet and nobody's checking their phone. It sounds casual when it starts. That's what makes it worse. My name isn't important anymore, but back then people called me Lena. This happened in 2014 in a desert town called Mesa Ridge, tucked outside of Phoenix. It wasn't big, just rows of beige houses, gravel yards, palm trees that looked out of place, and streets so quiet at night you could hear your own footsteps echo. I lived with Aunt Marcy and Uncle Ron. They weren't actually my aunt and uncle by blood. Marcy was my mom's best friend from college, and when my mom passed away, they took me in. They were good to me, normal, even boring. Ron worked in finance for a medical supply company, and Marcy sold houses all over southern Arizona. I was 17, drifting through my last year of high school, with no clue what I wanted to do next. I liked sports, but not in a super intense way. Volleyball was my thing for years, and then I switched to soccer mostly because I liked running until my head went quiet. Ron loved that I played. He used to sit in the stands and shout advice that didn't make sense. Marcy teased him about it, but I could tell she liked how close we were. With her, I did different things. Mall trips, face masks, long talks that drifted nowhere and everywhere at once. For months, Ron had been talking about moving. Somewhere cooler. Somewhere near the ocean. He said the desert made him feel stuck. When they asked how I felt, I shrugged and said I was fine with whatever. I didn't have many friends keeping me anchored, and I just ended things with a guy named Evan. Nothing dramatic. We just went quiet around each other and agreed to stop pretending. So when Ron said he'd been looking at places near Santa Cruz, it didn't scare me. It sounded like a reset button. A few weeks later, Marcy and Ron went on a short trip to check out neighborhoods. That left me alone in the house for the first time. I pretended it was no big deal, but once their car disappeared down the street, the house felt bigger. Too big, like it was stretching. I went out shopping to distract myself and came back in the afternoon. I swam in the pool for a while, floating on my back and watching clouds slide past. That's when Ron called to remind me it was Halloween. He laughed about how they used to take me trick-or-treating when I was little, how I insisted on carrying my own candy, even when the bag got heavier than my arm. He told me I'd need to hand out candy that night. There was a box above the fridge. And don't forget the old pumpkin lantern from the garage, the one with the flickering orange eyes. I promised I'd handle it. I even joked about surviving a night of monsters. After my shower, I dug out an old makeup kit and painted my face pale, sketching dark lines around my eyes and jaw. Not fancy, just enough to look wrong. I wore black clothes and made pizza. Everything felt normal, comfortably boring. Then I remembered the pumpkin. The garage smelled like dust and old cardboard. I couldn't find it at first. When I finally spotted it, it was sitting on a high shelf, just barely visible. I dragged over a wooden crate and climbed up. My fingers brushed the plastic handle. That's the last clean memory. I know I fell. I know my head hit something hard. What I don't know is how long I was out, because when I woke up, the garage felt different. Too quiet, like sound had been turned down. I stood up slowly, holding the shelf. My head throbbed. When I checked the time, more than 30 minutes were gone. That scared me more than the pain. The doorbell rang. Kids' voices floated through the door, laughing and yelling. I grabbed candy and opened up. 4 kids stood there. Their costumes were good, too good. The makeup looked cracked, like dried skin. One boy pointed at my face and said my blood looked real. I laughed it off, but when I looked down, my fingers were smeared red. I hadn't used red paint. After they left, I locked the door and sat down, telling myself I was overreacting. My head was injured. That was all. I closed my eyes just to rest. A loud knock snapped me awake. Not a doorbell. A knock, heavy and slow, The house felt cold. I don't mean chilly. I mean wrong. Like the air had weight. The knocking came again, closer somehow, even though the door hadn't moved. I looked through the peephole. Someone tall stood there, wrapped in black. No face, just darkness under a hood. I told myself it was a prank. Someone messing around. I turned away. My hand didn't listen. It reached out, unlocked the door, and pulled it open. The smell hit first. Damp, sweet, like old leaves and something rotten underneath. The figure didn't move. I tried to scream, but my throat barely worked. My body felt borrowed, like I was sitting behind my own eyes. I remember stumbling back. After that, everything blurs. I woke up on the couch with Marcy crying, and Ron holding my shoulders. They said they came home early because they had a bad feeling. They said I had a concussion, a deep cut on my head. They said no one else was in the house when they arrived. At the hospital, doctors said the hallucinations made sense. Head trauma can do that. Fear fills in the blanks. I nodded. I agreed. But here's the thing I don't tell people. The pumpkin lantern was sitting by the front door when we got home. Switched on, glowing softly. No one admitted to moving it. And sometimes, late at night, I wake up because my right hand is already reaching for the doorknob. I don't always remember standing up. I just know the lock is warm. And sometimes, when I lean close to the door, I swear I can smell something damp and sweet on the other side, waiting for me to finish what I started. I was 17 when this happened, not 16. 17 feels important, somehow. Old enough to be trusted, but still young enough to make dumb decisions without realizing it. My name's Rowan. At the time, I lived in a small, damp town called Greywick, tucked up near the coast in the north of England. The kind of place where the sky always looks tired, and the air smells faintly, like wet stone. This was back in 2013, one of those years that just felt heavy all the way through. That day started with a youth football tournament. Not mine. I wasn't playing. I was there because my cousin Theo was on a team, and my aunt insisted I come along to be supportive. Theo and I weren't close. We lived in the same house for a while after his dad moved away, but we were more like awkward roommates than family. It rained the entire day. Not drizzle, real rain. Thick, cold sheets of it. The kind that soaks your socks, even if you swear your shoes are waterproof. I stood near the edge of the pitch with my hood up, watching kids slip in the mud and parents shout encouragement that sounded more like threats. I remember staring out at the field and thinking very calmly that none of this felt real, like I was watching a scene meant for someone else's life. When we finally got back to the house, Theo smelled like mud and sweat and old grass. He thought it was hilarious to smear his muddy shorts against my jeans while laughing like it was the best joke in the world. I didn't laugh. I didn't even get mad. I just stood there and waited for it to be over. That evening, my aunt and her partner Mark said they were heading out to dinner. Theo was going to stay over at a teammate's place, someone I barely knew. Before they left, Mark looked at me and said, "You'll be fine here on your own, yeah?" I said yes, even though my stomach tightened when he said it. The house sat just outside town, near a stretch of narrow road that didn't get much traffic at night. A few fields, a few trees. Not enough to be scary, but enough to feel isolated when it got dark. About a mile away lived my great-aunt Lorna. She was in her late 80s and lived alone in a squat old brick house that always smelled like dust and boiled vegetables. I used to visit her with my aunt to help bring groceries or make tea. That night, everyone left while I was upstairs taking a shower. I came back down to silence. Not normal quiet. Not peaceful quiet. The kind of silence where you suddenly notice how loud your own breathing is. The house usually creaked and popped, especially in the rain. But that evening, it felt like it was holding its breath. I changed into old joggers and a hoodie and went to the kitchen to make something to eat. I wasn't good at cooking. I threw together toast and beans and burned the toast just a little. While it cooled, I stared out the kitchen window. Rain streaked down the glass in long, uneven lines, warping the view of the road outside. I ate on the sofa with the TV on low, mostly for background noise. I don't remember what was on. Some rerun. People laughing at things that weren't funny. Around 8:30, the house phone rang. We never used it. Ever. It was mostly there because it came with the house. The sound was sharp and sudden. It made me jump so badly, I spilled beans onto my sleeve. I stared at the phone from across the room and waited for it to stop. It didn't, so I let it go to voicemail. When the message picked up, the room filled with sound. Breathing, slow, wet, too close to the receiver. I stood up without realizing I was doing it. My heart was beating hard enough that I could feel it in my throat. The breathing didn't change. No voice, no words. Just breath, like someone was leaning over the phone, listening. After a long moment, the call ended. The phone rang again almost immediately. I didn't answer. I couldn't move. This time, the breathing was heavier, uneven. There was a faint clicking sound too, like teeth tapping together, or maybe someone's tongue hitting the roof of their mouth. I remember thinking very clearly that whoever it was knew I was listening. Then it stopped. I was still standing there when my mobile buzzed in my pocket. It nearly sent me through the ceiling. It was a message from my aunt. Go to Lorna's. Now, ambulance called. I didn't reply. I didn't grab a coat. I just shoved my feet into trainers and ran. The rain felt thicker outside, like running through falling ropes. My breath burned. The road stretched on longer than it ever had before. When I finally saw the flashing blue lights, my legs almost gave out. Great-Aunt Lorna had collapsed in her kitchen. She'd had a stroke. She couldn't move her right side, but somehow she'd managed to drag herself across the floor to reach the phone. That was what the paramedics told us. They said she'd called for help. She survived. Barely. She never spoke properly again. Later that night, after everything settled, after I was back home alone again, I checked the house phone. There were no saved voicemails. None. The call log was empty. I told myself it was a glitch. Old phones did that sometimes. But here's the part I don't usually tell people. A few days later, when I visited Lorna in the hospital, I asked her if she remembered calling for help. She looked at me for a long time, longer than felt comfortable. Then she shook her head. I didn't call anyone, she said, slow and quiet. I couldn't reach the phone. I laughed it off, sighed she must not remember. But as I stood there, I noticed something strange. Her hospital room phone was off the hook, and from somewhere down the hallway, faint but steady, I could hear breathing.
My name's Eli Mercer, and this happened back in 2014, when I was 22. That year, I was living in a small house on Maple Ridge Road, just outside a town called Hollis Creek. It wasn't really my house. It belonged to my Aunt Marla and her husband, Doug. I rented the basement room because it was cheap and close to my job at a shipping warehouse. Most nights, I was alone. Aunt Marla worked overnight shifts at a nursing home, and Doug traveled for construction jobs and was gone weeks at a time. Their son, Ryan, my cousin, was usually crashing at friends' places or staying out late. So the house had this long habit of being empty, quiet, and still, especially after dark. I got used to it. That night started like any other. I came home around 6:30 p.m., kicked off my boots, microwaved leftovers, and sank onto the living room couch with my phone. I remember thinking how quiet the place felt. No TV upstairs, no footsteps. Even the old fridge wasn't making its usual clicking noise. The house felt like it was holding its breath. Around 8:45, I heard something outside. It was faint at first, a soft scrape near the front porch, like someone dragging a shoe across concrete. I didn't react right away. There were always random sounds around there, wind knocking branches around, People cutting through yards to avoid the main road. I told myself it was nothing and kept scrolling. Then the sound came again. This time it was heavier, slower. Whatever it was didn't move off right away. It stayed there, shifting slightly, like someone standing and deciding what to do next. That's when I felt that tight feeling in my chest. The one you get before you're scared, when your body notices something your brain hasn't caught up to yet. I glanced at the clock on my phone. Almost pukul 9 p.m. Too late for joggers, too late for kids messing around. I muted my phone and listened. Footsteps started moving along the side of the house. Not fast, not sneaky, just steady, deliberate steps crunching on gravel. Each one sounded heavier than it should have been, like the ground was struggling to hold the weight. The couch sat beneath a narrow window that looked out toward the driveway. The blinds were closed, but there was a small gap near the top. I leaned back slightly, just enough to peek. That's when I saw skin, not a face, not eyes, just the smooth curve of a forehead pressed close to the glass. No hair, no eyebrows. The skin looked dull and tight, like it didn't quite fit whatever it was stretched over. I froze. The angle didn't make sense. To see that window from outside, someone would have had to stand far back on the driveway. That meant they were tall, way taller than anyone I knew, and they were standing completely still. I slid down the couch until I was barely visible, my heart pounding so hard I was sure it could hear it. The thing didn't move, didn't tap, didn't breathe loud enough for me to hear. After a few seconds, it stepped away. I waited, counting in my head, telling myself not to panic. Then the footsteps started again, circling toward the back of the house. That's when I realized something worse. The back porch had a huge sliding window. No blinds, just thin curtains. If it walked past that window, it would see everything. I moved as quietly as I could into the kitchen, then into the short hallway near the bathroom. My hands were shaking so badly, I had to press them against my thighs to steady them. The footsteps climbed onto the back porch. Wood creaked under weight. Something paced back and forth, slow and uneven, like it wasn't used to walking on boards. Then came the sound of the laundry room door handle rattling. Once, twice, harder the third time. I stood there, barely breathing, thinking about how thin the walls were, thinking about how old the locks were, thinking about how my phone had no signal in that part of the house. Then the sound stopped. No footsteps, no porch creaking, just silence. That was worse. I realized it could be anywhere now, under any window, watching. The stairs were right there. I took them two at a time and crouched near Ryan's old bedroom door. After a long minute, I crept to the window at the end of the hall and gently tilted the blind. I wish I hadn't. The thing stood below, beside the cellar doors that led to the basement. One door hung open. The other was being held by a long, pale hand with too many knuckles. I could see its body now. It wasn't wearing clothes. Its shape looked wrong, like someone had built it by memory instead of reference. Broad shoulders, narrow waist, arms that bent just a little too much at the elbows. Its skin stretched tight over bone, especially along its ribs and neck. It wasn't looking up. It was staring into the basement, into my room. Slowly, carefully, I backed away and locked myself in Aunt Marla's bedroom. I sat on the floor until my legs went numb. I don't remember falling asleep, but I must have, because the next thing I knew, morning light was creeping under the door. The cellar doors were closed when I checked. No footprints, no damage, no sign of anything. Aunt Marla came home later that day. I didn't tell her what happened. I didn't tell Ryan. I didn't tell anyone. I moved out 2 weeks later. Here's the part I don't like talking about. Every once in a while, late at night, when I'm lying in bed somewhere else, I hear that same slow-pacing sound outside my window. Gravel crunching, boards creaking, like something familiar is checking to see if I'm home. And sometimes, when I wake up, my phone is open on the nightstand, unlocked, with photos I don't remember taking. Photos of ceilings, photos of walls, photos taken from corners of rooms, angled downward, like someone taller than me was holding the phone and trying to remember how I looked when I slept. I stopped checking where they come from. I just lock my doors and leave the lights on, because whatever that thing was, I don't think it was trying to break in. I think it was looking for a way back inside.
Most people won't believe this. And honestly, I don't blame them. If someone had told me this story before it happened, I probably would have laughed and changed the subject. Still, I think about it more often than I should, especially when I'm alone at night. So yeah, believe it or don't, I just need to tell it the way I remember it. This happened back in 2014, when I was 12. I was spending a weekend at my aunt's house in a small coastal town called Greyhaven, the kind of place where everything smells like salt and wet pavement. I was staying with my cousin Mara. We weren't super close like best friends, but we got along well enough. We mostly saw each other at family gatherings, and those were usually loud and chaotic, so this was one of the first times it was just the two of us. Her house sat at the end of a quiet loop road, surrounded by low fences and overgrown hedges. It was a single-story place with peeling paint and windows that always seemed a little too dark, even during the day. Inside, the living room, kitchen, and dining space all blended together into one long room. The bedrooms were tucked down a short hallway, like they were trying to stay out of sight. It was early summer, warm but not unbearable. That afternoon, Mara suggested we walk down to the shoreline before it got dark. The beach was only a few blocks away, past an old shortcut locals used instead of the main road. It was a narrow dirt path boxed in by thick bushes that leaned toward each other, making the whole thing feel like a tunnel. Halfway through that path, I got this weird feeling. You know that sense you get when you're sure someone's behind you, even though you haven't heard anything yet? My shoulders tightened, and my steps slowed without me meaning to. Do you hear that? I asked. Mara didn't even stop walking. Hear what? I don't know. Just something. She laughed and told me the bushes were full of birds and lizards, that Greyhaven didn't have anything scary lurking around. I tried to laugh too, but the feeling stuck with me the whole way to the beach and back. Later that night, after dinner, her parents went to bed early. Her little brother slept in their room, so the house got quiet fast. Too quiet. Mara suggested we sleep in the living room instead of the guest room, mostly so we could stay up longer without being yelled at. We dragged cushions off the couch, piled blankets into a messy fort, and claimed the space as ours. Time passed in that blurry way it does when you're a kid and don't care about clocks. We whispered, joked, and made plans we both knew we'd never follow through on. The only light came from outside. There were no curtains on the living room window, just bare glass looking out onto the road. At some point, I noticed how bright the moon was. It hung low, casting long shadows across the floor. That's when I saw something move outside. At first, I thought it was a tree branch. Then it didn't move like one. There was a shape standing just beyond the window. Tall, way too tall. It didn't sway or shift like a person waiting around. It stood completely still, like it had been placed there on purpose. I didn't say anything at first. I just stared, my mouth dry, my heart starting to beat faster. Mara followed my gaze and went quiet too. We crawled closer, slow and careful, like sudden movement might make it notice us. The thing outside was massive, easily taller than the window frame. Its body looked thick and solid, almost bulky, like it was made of packed muscle. Moonlight caught on coarse fur that covered it from head to toe. The fur wasn't one color. It shifted between dark rust and pale silver, depending on where the light hit. Its head wasn't right. The shape reminded me of a dog, or maybe a wolf, but stretched in a way that made my stomach twist. The snout was long, the mouth slightly open, showing teeth that were too neat, too clean. Its ears pointed straight up, never twitching, never relaxing. It felt like it was waiting. I realized then that neither of us had turned on any lights. The room was dark, but not dark enough to hide us completely. I suddenly needed to know the time, like that would somehow help. I ran into the kitchen and flipped on the small overhead light. It cast a dim yellow glow that made everything look older and dirtier. Mara followed me without saying a word. When we went back, I tried turning on the living room light, but it only made the window reflect back at us. The outside disappeared into black glass, so I turned it off again. That's when I noticed the creature's head had moved. It was facing us now, not the window. Us. I swear its eyes caught the light for a second. Not glowing, exactly. More like reflecting, the way animal eyes do when a car passes by at night. Mara grabbed my arm so hard it hurt. Neither of us screamed. We just backed away, step by slow step, until we bumped into the couch. Then we crawled into the blanket fort and pulled everything tight around us, like thin fabric could somehow keep that thing out. I don't remember falling asleep. I remember lying there, listening. There were sounds outside. Soft ones. A faint scrape against the glass. Something that might have been breathing, slow and steady, like it had all the time in the world. Morning came eventually. Sunlight filled the room, warm and ordinary, like nothing strange had ever happened there. We waited a long time before leaving the fort. The window was clear. The road was empty. No marks. No footprints. Nothing. Mara didn't want to talk about it, and I didn't push. I went home later that day and tried to forget. I didn't. Years later, I looked up Greyhaven online. I found an old local forum, half abandoned. Buried deep in one thread were comments about something people used to see near the loop road. A tall shape, watching houses, always silent, always gone by morning. The thread ended suddenly. No explanations, no conclusions. I still think about that night sometimes, especially when I catch my reflection in a dark window and feel that same tightness in my chest. What scares me most isn't what we saw. It's the idea that it wasn't passing through. It knew exactly where it was standing, and it knew we were there. This happened back in 2014, and even now, I still think about it more than I'd like to admit. At the time, I was helping my older cousin Mark move into a new house. We weren't especially close, but we'd always gotten along well enough, and he needed the extra set of hands. He had just bought an old place on the edge of a small town called Ridgeway Falls, one of those towns where nothing much happens and most people keep to themselves. The house itself wasn't impressive. It was big, but in a tired way. Peeling paint, narrow windows. A yard that looked like it hadn't been properly cared for in years. Still, Mark was excited. He said the price was too good to pass up, and he didn't mind fixing it up over time. We spent most of the day hauling boxes, furniture, and old junk from the moving truck into the house. By late afternoon, my arms were shaking, my back hurt, and my shirt was soaked through with sweat. It didn't help that Mark had decided most of the heavy stuff belonged in the basement. By the time the sun went down, we were both wiped out. I lived almost an hour away, and I honestly didn't trust myself to drive that tired. When I mentioned it, Mark shrugged and said I could crash there. He told me there was an old guest bed set up in the basement from the previous owner. I remember hesitating for a second. The basement gave off a strange vibe. It wasn't dirty exactly, just off. The ceiling was low, the lights were dim, and the air smelled faintly damp, like cold concrete and old cardboard. Still, exhaustion won it. I told myself it was just a basement. Mark grabbed a couple of blankets, pointed me downstairs, and said we'd finish moving the last boxes in the morning. The bed wasn't as bad as I expected. The mattress sagged a little in the middle, but once I lay down, my body sank into it, heavy and relieved. I remember staring at the ceiling, listening to the house settle, pipes ticking softly. That's when I heard it. At first, it was faint, a soft dragging sound, like fabric being pulled slowly across concrete. I held my breath and listened. A few seconds passed, then another sound, a dull thump, then a pause. Then something that sounded almost like someone shifting their weight, trying not to make noise. I sat up slightly, my heart starting to beat faster. I told myself it was probably the house. Old houses made noises. Or maybe a raccoon had gotten in somehow. But the sounds kept happening, slow careful, too deliberate. It felt like whatever it was didn't want to be heard. I considered calling out to Mark, but the thought of yelling into the dark basement made my stomach twist. Instead, I lay back down and pulled the blanket up to my chest, pretending I was calm. Eventually, sheer exhaustion dragged me under, though my sleep was shallow and full of half-formed dreams. When I woke up, my neck was stiff and my mouth felt dry. Morning light filtered weakly through the small basement window. For a moment, everything felt normal. Then I remembered the noises. Upstairs, Mark was making coffee. He asked how I slept. I told him the bed was fine, then casually mentioned the strange sounds I'd heard. The smile slid off his face. He told me he'd heard noises too. Not just that night, but the night before as well. Scraping sounds. Soft footsteps. Sometimes from the basement, sometimes from the hallway outside his bedroom. He admitted he thought it was me moving around. Neither of us laughed. We tried to shrug it off. Mark said maybe the house had mice. Big ones, apparently. We didn't really believe it, but we didn't have a better explanation, and we still had work to do. Later that morning, I was carrying a box of old books down to the basement. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, the box slipped from my hands and hit the floor hard. Books spilled everywhere. As I crouched to pick them up, something caught my eye near the far wall, under the stairs. It was easy to miss. A thin metal loop, barely visible, flush with the concrete floor. I stared at it longer than I meant to. It didn't look like it belonged there. I called Mark down. He squatted beside me and frowned. The loop was cold when he touched it. He gave it a gentle tug. A section of floor lifted up. Underneath was a narrow opening leading to a small hidden space. Not tall enough to stand in. Bare concrete walls. No windows, no lights. Inside, we found a rolled-up sleeping bag, flattened from use. A plastic grocery bag filled with empty water bottles. A few food wrappers shoved into a corner. The air smelled stale. Human. Neither of us spoke for a long time. We searched the rest of the house. Every room, every closet. We found nothing else. No one. Mark wanted to call the police. Then he hesitated. He said it sounded crazy. What would he even tell them? In the end, he sealed the hidden space shut with a heavy board and screws. He joked about it, tried to lighten the mood, but his hands shook while he worked. I left shortly after. A few weeks later, Mark stopped answering my calls. I figured he was busy. Then his phone went straight to voicemail. I drove out to Ridgeway Falls one weekend to check on him. The house was quiet. His car was gone. Inside, everything looked untouched. No sign of a struggle. No note. In the basement, the board covering the hidden space was no longer screwed in. It was lying neatly against the wall. The opening was dark, and from somewhere deep inside the house, I heard a slow, careful movement. I was 11 the summer this happened, back in 1998, the year everyone thought flip phones were the coolest thing ever, and nobody locked their doors the way they do now. My cousin Aaron and I were staying at my Aunt Linda's house for a long weekend. Aaron was a year older than me, and even though we only saw each other a few times a year, we always fell back into the same rhythm. Same jokes, same dumb arguments, same habit of staying up way too late and whispering about things that scared us. Aunt Linda lived in a quiet little town called Pine Hollow. It wasn't really a town so much as a collection of houses surrounded by trees. Thick trees. The kind that block out sound and light and make everything feel a little cut off from the rest of the world. Her house sat at the end of a narrow road that didn't even have streetlights. At night, the dark there felt heavy, like it pressed against the windows. Aaron and I spent most of that day inside because it was hot and sticky out. Normally, his dad would have taken us outside to mess around in the yard, maybe throw a ball, or show us how to use the old tools in the shed. But he was away that weekend, and Aunt Linda didn't feel like supervising anything more dangerous than board games. So we did what kids always did back then. We played video games. Hours of them. Sitting cross-legged on the carpet, controllers warm in our hands, the TV buzzing softly. Every once in a while, we'd hear the house settle, pipes ticking, floorboards creaking, the normal sounds of an old place. Nothing that stood out at the time. Around 10, Aunt Linda poked her head into the room and told us to get ready for bed. She smiled, but she looked tired, like she wanted the house quiet more than anything. Erin took the bed, and I laid out a sleeping bag on the floor. We joked around for a bit, whispering and laughing until the lights were off and everything went still. I fell asleep fast. That deep, heavy kind of sleep where you don't dream right away. I don't know how long I'd been out when I woke up. My mouth felt dry. My head felt thick, like I was underwater. At first, I didn't move. I just lay there, staring at the dark ceiling, listening. That's when I noticed the hallway light. A faint glow leaked under the bedroom door. That wasn't right. Aunt Linda always turned it off at night. She hated wasting electricity. I rolled onto my side and squinted toward the doorway. The door itself was cracked open just a little. I was sure we'd closed it. I remember hearing the latch click. And standing in that narrow gap was someone. Not fully inside the room. Just there. I couldn't see a face. Just a shape. Tall. Too tall to be Erin. The figure wasn't moving, but I had the strange feeling it was leaning slightly forward, like it was trying to see me without stepping closer. I remember thinking, half asleep, that it must be my uncle. Maybe he'd come home early. That thought didn't make much sense, but sleepy logic doesn't care about details. I wanted to say something. I wanted to call out. But my throat felt tight, and my body felt heavy, like if I tried to move, something bad would happen. After a few seconds, maybe longer, I closed my eyes and told myself I was imagining it. When I opened them again, the hallway light was gone. The door was shut. I fell back asleep, but it wasn't peaceful. My dreams were choppy and strange. I kept hearing soft footsteps that never quite reached me. In the morning, everything felt normal again. Sunlight through the curtains, the smell of coffee and toast, Erin acting like nothing had happened. While we ate breakfast, Aunt Linda mentioned that my uncle would be back late that evening. That's when my stomach tightened. I asked her, casually, if anyone had checked on us during the night. She shook her head. Nope, I didn't even get up once. I looked at Erin. He raised an eyebrow. Later, when Aunt Linda stepped outside to take a phone call, I told Erin what I'd seen. I laughed a little while I said it, trying to make it sound like no big deal. But he didn't laugh back. He said he'd woken up too, not fully, just enough to hear something moving around downstairs. He'd assumed it was the house making noise. That was when we decided to look around. We didn't say anything to Aunt Linda at first. We just started checking doors and windows, pretending it was a game. Everything upstairs looked fine. Locked, closed. The living room was the same. Kitchen too. Then we went down to the basement. Aunt Linda rarely went down there. The stairs were narrow and steep, and the air smelled damp, like old cardboard and dust. At the bottom was a small spare room she used for storage. The door was open. Inside, the room looked wrong. Not messy in a normal way. More like someone had been careful, but careless at the same time. A blanket folded on the floor. An empty bottle near the wall. Footprints in the dust. Erin whispered that the room had been clean the last time he was there. That's when we heard something upstairs. A slow creak, like weight shifting. We ran. Aunt Linda didn't question us when we told her. She went pale and told us to stay outside while she called the police. They searched the house, found an open window near the basement. said it looked like someone had been using the room for a while. They never found anyone. That night, we slept with the lights on. Years later, I still think about that shape in the hallway. The way it didn't move. The way it felt aware of me. Sometimes I wonder if it really left at all. Because every now and then, when I wake up in the middle of the night, I feel that same heavy stillness. Like something is standing just out of sight, waiting for me to notice it again. Let me tell you a story the way I usually tell it when someone asks why I don't like staying overnight in big empty buildings anymore. I always laugh a little when I start, like it's no big deal. But it is. It really is. This happened back in 2014, when I was 16. My name doesn't matter much, but for the sake of the story, call me Evan. The people with me weren't my teammates or close friends. They were part of a mixed youth volunteer group I'd joined that year. Some of us barely knew each other. A few were cousins, some were neighbors, some were just kids who signed up because their parents made them. That weekend, we were supposed to stay overnight at an old community sports complex called Redwood Hall, way out past the edge of town. It used to be a big deal decades ago. Local tournaments, summer camps, stuff like that. By the time we got there, it was mostly used for storage, and the occasional event nobody wanted to host anywhere nicer. I remember being excited on the drive out. I was sitting next to Mason, who was technically my second cousin, though we hadn't grown up together. He was easy to talk to, and we joked the whole way there about sneaking snacks and staying up too late. It felt like it was going to be one of those nights you remember for the fun parts. That feeling didn't survive the first 5 minutes inside the building. Redwood Hall smelled wrong. Not just old or dusty. It smelled damp, like cold concrete and metal that had been sitting in the dark too long. The lights buzzed when they flickered on, and the sound echoed down the long hallways in a way that made everything feel hollow. Too big, like the building was mostly empty, even when we were all standing there together. The moment I stepped inside, I got this tight feeling in my chest. You know when you walk into a room and immediately want to turn around, but you can't explain why? It was like that. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting someone to be standing there. No one ever was. I didn't say anything. I didn't want to be that person. We dumped our bags in what used to be a locker room. The lockers were still there, dented and rusty, with numbers scratched into the metal. Some of the doors hung open. A few of them looked like they'd been forced. I kept imagining hands reaching out when I wasn't looking. To shake it off, I went outside with Mason and a couple of the others. The air felt better out there, even though it was cold. Someone suggested we hang out in the old office area where there were still a few working computers. That sounded normal enough, so we went. We played dumb games, watched videos, talked about school and stuff that didn't matter. For a while, I almost forgot how uneasy I'd felt earlier. Almost. Then Lena, one of the girls from the group, stopped mid-sentence and asked if anyone else heard that. We all went quiet. At first, it just sounded like a soft scraping noise. Slow, rhythmic, like something heavy being dragged across the floor. It was coming from the storage room next to us, the one filled with old trophies and display pieces. Someone laughed and said it was probably the air system kicking on. I wanted to believe that. I really did. But the sound didn't stop. I figured someone was messing with us. Maybe Mason, maybe one of the older kids, trying to scare everyone. Feeling annoyed more than scared, I stood up and walked toward the storage room. The door was already open. Inside, rows of dusty shelves held plaques, cracked helmets, and these life-sized statues of athletes. They were old, painted in faded school colors, frozen in mid-action poses. I scanned the room, ready to call someone out. That's when one of the statues shifted. It wasn't a big movement, just a slight turn of the head, but it was enough. The sound I'd heard was the stone base scraping against the floor. The statue's painted eyes were now facing directly toward me. I froze. It felt like the air got thicker, like my ears were filling up. My heart started pounding so hard it hurt. The statue didn't blink, didn't move again. It just stared. I stepped backward without turning around, my foot catching on the doorway. I looked away the second I was out of the room. I didn't scream. I didn't tell anyone. I just sat back down and pretended nothing happened. The rest of the night moved on, but I didn't feel right again. When it was time to sleep, we laid our bags out in the main gym. The lights were dimmed, leaving long shadows stretched across the floor. I lay there listening to breathing, to the occasional cough or shuffle, trying to convince myself I was safe because I wasn't alone. I didn't fall asleep. Around midnight, my stomach started twisting. Not like I was sick, more like a deep nervous ache. I sat up and quietly walked to one of the high windows to get some air. That's when I saw him. He stood in the middle of the field outside, just beyond the fence. Tall, too still. He wasn't wearing anything that made sense for the weather. His face was pale, even in the dark, and he was staring straight at the building. At me. I leaned closer to the glass, my breath fogging it up. I told myself it was a shadow, a trick of the light. But then he took a step forward. I heard someone gasp behind me. Mason was awake too. His face was drained of color, his eyes locked on the same spot. We didn't say a word. We didn't need to. Later, when everyone else was asleep, I heard whispering, right outside the window. Not loud, not clear, just enough to know it was there. Saying something? Saying my name, I think. Or maybe Mason's. Or maybe neither. I stayed awake until morning. Before we left, someone mentioned there was an old burial ground past the field. It had been there long before Redwood Hall was built. I don't know if that matters. What I do know is this. Sometimes when I'm lying in bed at night, I hear that same scraping sound. And sometimes, when I look out my window, I feel like I'm being watched again. I never check. This happened in northern Idaho in 2004, back when I was 16. I didn't live with my parents then. I was staying with my older cousin Mara, while my mom was dealing with health stuff out of state. Mara had just turned 28 and rented a small log cabin outside a town called Pine Hollow. Calling it a town might be generous. It had one gas pump, a diner that closed at sunset, and a post office that only opened 3 days a week. The cabin sat way out past the tree line, where the road stopped being paved and turned into packed dirt and gravel. If you drove too fast, rocks would rattle against the underside of your car like something trying to get in. The nearest neighbor was far enough away that you couldn't see their lights at night. When it snowed, the silence felt heavy, like the world had been wrapped up and sealed shut. Mara worked late shifts at a small care facility about 40 minutes away. On the nights she worked, it was just me and her boyfriend, Lucas. Lucas wasn't much older than her, quiet most of the time, always tired. He had a habit of standing still when he thought, like he'd forgotten his body was attached to his head. We got along fine, but we weren't close. We mostly shared the space without really talking. That night was cold enough that the windows had frosted over from the inside. The kind of cold that creeps through walls, no matter how high you turn the heater. It was close to 11. Lucas was in the bedroom, already asleep, and I was in the kitchen rinsing dishes from dinner. Mara wouldn't be home until after midnight. While I waited for the water to heat up, I stared out the kitchen window. The porch light was on, throwing a soft yellow circle onto the snow. I remember thinking how quiet everything was. No wind, no animals, not even the sound of trees moving. Then the porch light clicked off. It wasn't gradual. It didn't flicker. It just went dark. At first, I thought the bulb had burned out. That happens. But then my eyes adjusted, and I realized the darkness outside the window wasn't empty. Something was blocking the faint glow coming from the sky. A shape, too close to the glass. I leaned forward a little, squinting. The window was fogged from the heat inside, so I wiped a clear spot with the sleeve of my sweatshirt. That's when I saw the face. It was right there, close enough that I could see the outline of a nose pressed near the glass. I couldn't make out details at first, just the shape of a head, tilted slightly, like it was studying me. Before I could move, a sudden white light exploded into my eyes. It felt like someone had shoved a flashlight straight into my skull. I yelped and stumbled back, my hand knocking into a stack of plates. My eyes burned, watering so badly I couldn't see anything for a few seconds. By the time I could see again, the light was gone. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I stood there, breathing fast, staring at the window like it might blink back at me. After a moment, I forced myself to walk down the hallway and knock on the bedroom door. Lucas opened it halfway, hair sticking up, clearly annoyed. "There's someone outside," I said. My voice came out thin and shaky. They were right at the window. He stared at me for a second, then sighed. "You probably saw a reflection or something," he said. "It's late." They shined a light in my face, I said. "On purpose." He rubbed his eyes and stepped past me, grabbing his jacket from the hook by the door. He flipped the porch light back on and opened the door, stepping outside barefoot in the snow, like it didn't bother him. I watched from behind, my stomach twisted tight. He looked around, turning in a slow circle. "There's no one here," he called back. "You're fine." He shut the door and went back to bed without another word. I didn't feel fine. I went back to the kitchen window, forcing myself to look. The porch light was on again. The snow was smooth and untouched. No footprints, no movement. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had just stepped away instead of leaving. I was halfway through locking the back door when the front doorknob twisted hard. Not a test, not a jiggle. A full, violent twist. I froze. Then it happened again. And again. The handle rattled like someone was angry at it, like they expected it to give in. I screamed for Lucas. He came running down the hallway, just as something slammed against the door. The whole frame shook. Snow fell from the porch roof in a soft rush. Lucas grabbed a kitchen knife from the counter. I grabbed the phone with shaking hands, but there was no signal. There never was out there. The pounding didn't stop. It got louder, closer. Whoever was outside started kicking the door, each hit slower than the last, like they were pacing themselves. Then headlights swept across the windows. Mara's car. The pounding stopped instantly. By the time she burst through the door, breathless and confused, there was nothing outside. No footprints, no damage. Just silence and the hum of her engine cooling down. We told her everything. She called the sheriff anyway. He came out, walked around with a flashlight, asked a few questions, then shrugged it off. Probably kids, probably nothing. 2 weeks later, Mara got a call. The sheriff asked us to come in. They'd picked up 2 people trying to break into an empty house a few miles away. When they showed us photos, my stomach dropped. I didn't recognize their faces exactly, but something about them felt wrong in a familiar way. Like a bad smell you can't place. The sheriff said they'd found rope in their truck, a knife, duct tape, a flashlight with an unusually strong beam. Mara decided we were moving. We packed fast, left things behind. The cabin sat empty after that. No one else rented it. Years later, I heard from someone in Pine Hollow that the cabin burned down. Electrical fire, they said. Sometimes, late at night, I still think about that face in the window. How close it was. How patient. And I wonder if the porch light really burned out that first time, or if someone was already standing there, reaching up, deciding when to let me see them. And I wonder what would have happened if Mara had worked a little later that night, or if the door had been weaker, or if whoever stood outside hadn't left at all, but simply stepped back into the trees, waiting for another light to turn off. I was 11 years old in the summer of 2013, and my parents decided it was time for me to bond more with family. That's how they put it. What that really meant was that I was going to spend a weekend at my aunt's house, hanging out with my cousin Noah. Noah was a year older than me, and technically we were related, but we barely knew each other. He'd moved to town from somewhere else a couple of years earlier, and family gatherings were awkward enough that we mostly stayed on opposite sides of the room. He wasn't mean or anything, just off, quiet in a way that made you notice the silence when he stopped talking. His house was on the edge of a small town called Pine Hollow, the kind of place where the trees grew close together and the streets got darker way faster than they should. When my parents dropped me off, the sun was still up, but the shadows already felt long and heavy, like they were leaning in. Noah acted excited to see me, but it didn't feel real. He smiled without showing his teeth and kept staring at my face a little too long, like he was checking something. Still, I told myself I was being dramatic. We were kids. It was just a weekend. Inside, the house smelled old. Not dirty, just stale, like the air hadn't been changed in a while. Noah showed me around. The living room had a big TV and shelves full of DVDs, most of them unlabeled. His room was at the end of the hallway. It was large, way too large for one kid, and packed with stuff. Toys, books, old electronics, broken clocks, and boxes stacked against the walls. Everything felt watched, like the room remembered things. We played video games for a while. Racing games, fighting games, the loud kind. Noah laughed at the wrong moments and stayed quiet when he was supposed to be frustrated. When I beat him, he didn't react at all. He just stared at the screen and said, "It's fine. We can play again later." That sentence stuck with me. Something about the way he said, "later." That night, my aunt said we could stay up as long as we wanted. Eventually, though, the house got quiet. Too quiet. I laid out a sleeping bag on the floor next to Noah's bed. He didn't use a nightlight. The room was dark, except for a thin stripe of light from the hallway. I lay there listening to the house. Pipes knocking, wood creaking. Normal stuff, but each sound felt closer than it should have. Noah turned over in his bed a few times, and I could hear him breathing. Slow, careful. I finally fell asleep. I woke up feeling like I couldn't breathe. The sleeping bag was pulled tight around me, zipped all the way up to my chin. On top of that, a heavy blanket was wrapped over my head. The air inside was hot and smelled dusty, like something pulled out of a closet. My skin was slick with sweat. I panicked and started moving, but the bag barely budged. My heart was slamming so hard, I thought it might tear through my chest. I clawed at the zipper until it finally slid down, and I shoved the blanket off my face. The room looked the same, but it felt different, thicker, like the darkness had weight. Noah was sitting up in his bed. He wasn't asleep. He was just watching me. I asked him why he did that. My voice came out shaky, way quieter than I meant it to. He tilted his head and said, "Did what?" I told him about the sleeping bag, the blanket. He shook his head slowly and said he never touched me. His voice was calm, almost bored. When I insisted, his face changed. Not angry exactly, but tight, like he was trying not to smile. He told me to stop lying. That scared me more than if he'd yelled. I turned away and pretended to sleep, staring at the wall until my eyes burned. I don't know how long I stayed awake after that, but at some point, I must have passed out again. Morning light woke me. The room was empty. Noah's bed was made. Too neat. I sat up and felt my stomach drop. I needed the bathroom bad. I walked to the door and tried the handle. It didn't move. I tried again. Harder, locked. I knocked. I called his name. Nothing. The house was silent, like no one else was home. My phone had barely any signal, but I managed to call my mom. I told her I wanted to leave. I didn't explain why. I didn't have to. She said she'd come get me. I waited and waited. Eventually, my aunt unlocked the door. She didn't ask why I was locked in. She didn't look surprised. She just said my mom was outside. Noah wasn't anywhere in sight. We drove home without speaking. That night, I was in my room, trying to forget everything, when the doorbell rang. My mom said Noah was there to see me. I didn't want to go, but she insisted. He stood on the porch, smiling that same closed-mouth smile. He asked why I left without saying goodbye. I told him the truth. He said I was making things up. He said I always had been dramatic. I went back inside and shut my door. A few minutes later, something hit my window. Glass exploded inward, scattering across the floor. I screamed. My parents ran in. Outside, the yard was empty, except for muddy footprints under my window. They didn't lead away. They led around the house. For weeks after that, I couldn't sleep. I'd wake up sweating, feeling like something heavy was pressing down on me. Sometimes I'd find my blankets wrapped tight, even though I knew I hadn't moved. We never saw Noah again. My aunt said he'd gone to live somewhere else. She wouldn't say where. Years later, I looked up Pine Hollow. The house was gone. No record of it ever being there. But every once in a while, when I wake up in the middle of the night, I hear slow breathing that isn't mine. And I swear something is standing just out of reach, waiting for me to fall asleep again. I grew up in a town called Red Willow, the kind of place most people pass without realizing it has a name. One blinking traffic light. One grocery store that also sells bait and birthday cards. Everybody waves, even if they don't remember why they know you. Back in 2018, I thought that meant the town was safe. I was 14 that summer. Not a kid anymore, but not old enough for people to take you seriously either. I lived with my Aunt Mara, who worked double shifts at a nursing home and trusted the town more than she should have. She always said Red Willow took care of its own. That afternoon was miserable. The air felt thick, like the heat had weight to it. Sweat stuck to my back, no matter where I stood. My cousin Lena was visiting for a few weeks, sleeping on a mattress in my room, and we were already sick of being inside. Lena wasn't really my cousin, not by blood. She was my aunt's best friend's kid, but we grew up together, so it counted. We decided to walk to her dad's place on the other side of town and stay the night there. We packed a backpack, filled 2 water bottles, and stepped outside just as the sun dipped behind the trees. That's when we heard the ice cream truck. Now, that truck had been coming through Red Willow forever. Same faded white paint. Same tinny song that sounded like it was playing underwater. The guy who usually drove it was named Carl, a quiet older man who always wore a baseball cap and gave kids extra napkins. He knew everyone. But when the truck rolled up that day, Carl wasn't behind the wheel. The man inside leaned out too far, like he wanted a better look at us. He had dark, wet-looking hair stuck to his forehead and skin that looked stretched tight over his face, like he'd been out in the sun too long. His smile stayed a second too late. "What'll it be?" he asked, dragging the words out. Lena squeezed my arm. I asked where Carl was. The man said Carl needed a break and laughed, like it was an inside joke I wasn't part of. His eyes never stopped moving, bouncing between us and the empty street behind us. We didn't buy anything. We walked away fast, trying not to look like we were hurrying. A few minutes later, the music started again behind us. It followed us, stopping when we stopped, starting again when we moved. Once, the truck rolled past without the music, just the engine ticking and whining, slow enough that I could smell something sour coming from it. When I looked inside, the back was dark, way darker than it should have been. We cut through Briar Field, the half-finished park no one ever used. Lena said she felt stupid being scared. I said I didn't. My stomach felt tight, like it does right before you throw up. Near the edge of the field, we ran into Noah, a kid Lena used to babysit. He told us the ice cream man asked him where he lived and got mad when Noah wouldn't answer. That's when Lena said we should split up for a bit, take different routes so we wouldn't lead the truck anywhere important. I didn't like that idea, but I didn't have a better one. We promised to meet at the yellow house near the old railroad tracks. I never made it there. About 10 minutes after we split up, I heard tires crunching slowly behind me. No music, just the sound of rubber and gravel, and someone breathing through an open window. I ran. I don't remember falling, but suddenly my hands were scraped raw and my knees burned. I crawled under a porch, pulling myself into a space full of cobwebs and damp wood. I pressed my mouth shut with both hands to keep from making noise. The truck stopped nearby. A door slammed. Footsteps moved closer, slow and careful. Something metal scraped against the ground. A man started talking, not yelling, just talking, like he knew I could hear him. He said my name. I still don't know how he knew it. I stayed there until my muscles shook and my legs went numb. Eventually, the footsteps moved away. The truck started again. The music played once. Just once. The police came later. Aunt Mara cried. Lena never showed up at the yellow house. Her dad said she never arrived at his place either. They found the ice cream truck abandoned outside of town 2 days later. Empty. Clean. Like it had never been used. People still talk about that summer, but they don't talk about Lena. Not really. They say she ran away. They say teenagers do that. Sometimes, late at night, I hear that song drifting through Red Willow. Soft, warped, like it's coming from far away. And sometimes, when I look out the window, I swear I see a white truck parked just past the trees, engine off, waiting.